Welcome everyone to CG seminar stroke webinar number 247. It's beginning to sound like one of those very large cricket scores that you only get occasionally. 247. Great opportunity today to learn a lot more than most of us know, but more of what we should know about engineering education. And we have a very good cast to help us with that. I'm going to hand over to Jenni Case in a moment. Jenni's a valued colleague on the journal Higher Education and the head of Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech. Jenni will introduce the other speakers, but before I give you to Jenni, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, the webinar is being recorded as usual and will be posted online. It'll be on YouTube within 48 hours, probably sooner than that. Transcript of the chat function will be also posted on our CG website. You can see all of the CG webinars directly on our website, going right back to the beginning of the webinar series in April 2020. Now, during the webinar, we advise you to keep yourself muted. Interference from your sound can be a problem for the webinar. And of course, unmute yourself when you're coming into the webinar to ask a question or make a statement. There's no need to have your video on either, but again, we advise you to turn it on if you can, if you're coming into the discussion directly. We recommend using the speaker view commands, which in the top right-hand corner there, so you can more clearly see who is talking. Now, to ask a question, use the chat. Write your question or your statement, if you want to make a statement, into the chat, and then we'll select you out of the chat for participation in the Q&A session. Now, if we get to the point where we can bring you in, and if you come in early with your question or statement in the chat, you're very likely to get selected into the discussion. Then I'll give you a warning in the chat. I'll send you a little message saying we're going to invite you in. And when you come in, most important process is to unmute yourself, switch on your video if you can, and when you come onto camera, state your name and where you are from, and then say what you wish to say. Well, it's a delight to now pass over to Jenni, and I'll leave it to her to introduce everyone else.
Thank you very much, Simon, and what a great honor to be presenting in this amazing series of CG webinars, and also just my great pleasure to have been engaged in CG throughout. I've just learned so much from this incredible community of researchers. And then thank you, Simon, for entertaining the idea of having a engineering education, higher education crossover thing today. And so you'll see our title here, From Theory to Application and Back Again. And I think the back again is really the focus for today, the interplay between research in higher education and engineering education. I'm really excited at the group I managed to persuade to join me on this venture today. Mike Klassen from the University of Toronto, David Knight from Virginia Tech with me in my department here, Xiaofeng Tang, Tsinghua University, and Nicky Wolmarans from the University of Cape Town. So to jump right in with what we're going to be trying to do today, I want to just situate engineering education within this broader context of discipline-based education research, which has really seen tremendous growth in the last few decades. And I mean, many areas of discipline-based education research, like mathematics education or chemistry education, obviously you started with a very strong basis in high schools, in the K-12 sector, but really the focus on universities has grown so much. As you would assume, and as most of us assume, the reason these fields exist is to inform the discipline, how best to teach, how to structure their curricula, to deal with issues around what are the employment prospects for their graduates. And so it's sort of, there's kind of an assumed one-way direction of flow. Maybe if we're lucky, they may draw something from education research, but you know, folks are more generally looking at higher education research would not typically read those journals. As you know, all of us in the team today have worked quite a bit in engineering education research. We see it as part of DIBA, is the way some people pronounce it more generally. And there are very active debates on the nature of the field, who participates, what theory, what methods we use, and many of the people in the group with me here have engaged with me in that exploration. What we want to do today is something maybe a bit bold, and honestly, we want to see if what we're doing has any interest for those who are engaged more generally in higher education research. In the panel, these are 4 engineering ed researchers that really struck me as people who I think very deliberately have examined the higher ed literature in relation to their engineering ed work, who use theories and questions from higher education, and many of them actually have published their work in higher education journals. So what I asked each of them to do, one slide, pick one paper, give us an overview of some key findings, and answer this question, really, what value may these findings have for the broader higher education research community as represented today in the CGHE seminar? And with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the first speaker, Nicky Wolmarans. Over to you, Nicky.
Yeah, thanks, Jenni. The main focus of my research is on the application of specialized knowledge in the real world. It's an attempt to balance traditional education that focused almost exclusively on learning disciplinary knowledge with the marketization of education, where knowledge is being stripped in favor of relevance and generic personal attributes. So balancing the tension between theory and practice has always been challenging for the professions. But the modern turn towards work-ready graduates and a shift from specialized knowledge to relevance has even started making its way into general and liberal arts type degrees. But engineering is still a very useful case study. Because it's got a pretty clearly defined knowledge base, the knowledge is quite easy to spot in research. But it's also always faced towards the workplace. And there's always been this concern with relevance in education and work-ready graduates. So the tension between knowledge and practice, work readiness and graduate attributes has always been part of the curriculum conversation. So I think that certainly in relation to this knowledge attributes debate, engineering education research has got quite a lot to offer to the broader HE space. My own research has drawn mostly from the work of professional practice scholars, specifically Donald Schoen, Herbert Simon, and Andrew Abbott, but also from knowledge theorists. So the theoretical foundations lie with the likes of Basil Bernstein, Joe Muller, Lisa Wheeler-Hann, and Carl Mayton. The empirical data comes from the empirical data of this study comes from 3 trajectories of 17 substantive projects located in 2 different engineering curricula. These projects serve some level of preparation for practice in the curriculum. So although I've used engineering as my object of study, it provides the empirical data, the theoretical generalizability does extend more generally into the HE space. There are a couple of things that this type of research helps to surface. First of all, it raises warnings that education can't replicate the workplace because the logic of the 2 contexts is profoundly different. So for example, the measure of success is necessarily different. Success in education is based on the demonstration of competence, be that competence in knowledge or in skills. Problems and tasks are merely the vehicles for demonstrating that competence. On the other hand, in the workplace, success is based on the success of the end product by whatever means one gets the job done. And by that product, I mean a thing, a process, customer satisfaction, whatever the product or output might be. But basically, in education, the priority is on how something is done. In the workplace, it's the results of what is done. Another major difference is that the tasks or problems originate quite differently. They've got different starting points and different objectives shape them. In the workplace, people are responding to issues that emerge from the complexity of the world. So the problem starts in the real world. That means really understanding the contextual details and also an ability to cut to the core of the problem. In education, the problem or task is motivated and constructed around specific learning objectives. The problem or task starts with the learning objective. The contextual complexity is constructed around and focused towards that learning objective. And then finally, I'd like to argue that one of the main reasons that knowledge is being stripped from education in favor of graduate attributes is that the same knowledge looks very different in the two contexts. Unless we start focusing on helping students to translate between the way that academic knowledge works in the academia into the way that that knowledge works in the workplace, knowledge won't look useful. I think this is why knowledge is being stripped from education in a drive towards work readiness. It's not because knowledge is not useful, but because most graduates don't know how to make it useful. They're then trapped into this idea of precedent, using what's worked before without access to the power of specialized knowledge. So unless in education, we start helping students to learn to translate knowledge out of academia and into practice, it's us as educators that are stripping specialized knowledge of its power. So thanks. David, I'm going to pass over to you now.
Great, thank you, Nikki, and very excited to be here with you all today. When Jenny posed this question, I started thinking about my own research and how I think about the higher ed space as providing big ideas, theoretical perspectives, policy ideas, and then what I do in the engineering ed space is really take those ideas and try to apply them within a specific context. I think my engineering friends would call this model verification or validation, and my higher ed friends would particularly those in the economic space, would call this a way to look at some of the unobservable variables that sometimes we see in modeling efforts within the higher ed space. And so I thought about a paper that would illustrate what I mean by this, and chose one that is first authored by Dustin Grody. He's now in teacher education at Weber State University, and then my colleagues Walter Lee and Bev Watford here at Virginia Tech. And what we did is we took this big idea from higher ed, where this is a pretty common phenomenon across states here in the US, where we have an articulation agreement between a community college system and four-year institutions. And the real goal of this is to get students to be able to transfer from one institution to another in the pursuit of a bachelor's degree, in our context, within engineering. And so when we started this project, we thought we were going to look at articulation agreements. And what we found when we were working within the engineering ed space on the ground, speaking with stakeholders whose job is to enact and implement this policy, we learned that it's not that easy of a story. And so in this paper, what we did is we focused our analyses on the faculty and academic advisors who are responsible for implementing the articulation policy. They're responsible for working with students before they transfer and after they transfer to select classes, make good decisions about their academic programs. And what we found is that when we really spoke with the people on the ground that had to implement this policy, it's a really fuzzy situation. We brought in the lens of street level bureaucracy to guide our findings. And so this is from the public policy space, that it's really important to talk to the people on the ground to understand what actually happens with the policy. Much of our research in the higher ed space is around policy design, particularly around articulation agreements, but the policy implementation space often gets overlooked or doesn't have as much research behind it. And this is where I think a DBER type of approach can be really helpful to higher ed, where we can test out some of these ideas on the ground. In the case of this paper, what we found is that we have this articulation agreement between institutions, but what happens is that students get on campus at a four-year institution and they run into a bunch of other policies that are not taken into account in the design of the broader articulation policy. So in this case, what we found is there's a college level enrollment management policy. So effectively, students start at a community college, transfer institutions following the articulation agreement, but then they find that they have to do a series of other steps before they're able to actually enroll in their degree granting major within engineering. And this can become really frustrating for students. It can extend time to degrees, and you also start seeing students and advisors try to make sense of these policy collisions And you get different kinds of advice for students, and you get different interpretations of the policy collision among those stakeholders. And so I think it's a really good example of, on paper, higher ed policy looking really great, but the deeper context can be really useful in showing how it actually plays out on the ground and how it's a much messier situation than what the original design entailed. And I'll wrap up my comments there and pass it on to Mike.
Thanks, David. I love the framing of this webinar. It's really relevant to me personally. I started my education research journey with a really strong informal mentorship within engineering education, but chose to do my master's and then my PhD in higher education to kind of take one step away and gather some different tools and theoretical perspectives. So the paper I put forward here, the short title is "Do Global Norms Matter?" It's a paper I wrote with my supervisor, and it was meant to be a pilot study for my PhD thesis. In broad strokes, this is taking a look at the question of how do global agreements around accreditation requirements in engineering, which are shifting, exactly the kind of thing Nicky's talking about, shifting from a heavy knowledge focus to a more graduate attributes focus. How do they land in different national contexts? And within a national context, how do they get taken up differently by different institutions? So this was a multiple case study of 3 Canadian engineering schools. And the questions we posed related to how is this new accreditation regime kind of changing the organizational structures and processes for how curriculum decisions get made. So in terms of framing this, not as just as an engineering education question, but as a higher education question, we draw on institutional theory, specifically Scott's 3 institutional pillars: the regulative, the normative, and the cultural cognitive, to really explore like what is the work that accreditation is doing, and how is that being interpreted differently in different institutions. And some interesting things come out of that when you frame it in that way. Firstly, taking engineering as a kind of case example has some interesting features. I mean, in terms of global labor markets, there's a high degree of mobility of engineers, large role of kind of multinational corporations, and we have these incredibly strong international agreements. You know, the Washington Accord being the most notable, started with 6, it's now above 20 countries, with the likes of India and China now being signatories. And you know, that is an example of the kind of isomorphism of quality assurance via global regimes that we see increasingly being documented in the higher ed and the comparative literature. So, you know, engineering lets us look into the details a little bit more. How is that playing out? From an institutional theory perspective, essentially we have these institutional pressures that professional schools kind of need to conform to global norms to be seen as legitimate. And yet what the findings of this study and other work that I've been doing show is that you have substantial variations in response. It's not simple exact conformity at every university, depending on leadership, depending on departmental structures, depending on the status of the institution and how much they think the accreditors are really going to call, you know, their education into question. We see a range of responses to the same policy just within one country. A couple of other interesting elements of this study that speak to the theory to application and back again. One of them is that one of the core data sources for the project, for this paper, was actually engineering education articles written by authors in these institutions describing their curriculum change process, describing their experience with accreditation, and kind of studying the changing landscape within Canada. So we use that as data to feed into the study. And we also position the Canadian Engineering Education Association as an institutional actor. It's playing a role legitimizing these discourses and kind of normalizing the shift in accreditation that's happening within the national landscape. So I think there's a kind of interesting set of decisions there around, you know, when is this literature that you're citing and when is it actually data that's helping you gain insights into the dynamics. I mean, at the big picture level from this study and other work I've done, trying to position engineering within the higher education literature, I think what we gain when we look in depth, like at one particular professional field, we start to get a bit more nuanced picture particularly in my case, at how do core decisions about the curriculum, what gets taught and how and by who and how it's assessed, that governance is different across disciplines, particularly when we talk about professional fields. And so I think we get a more differentiated picture of what Burton Clark talked about in his seminal work, the small worlds and the different worlds that academics live in. And I think that's a great place for this conversation to continue between engineering ed and higher ed. And with that, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Denver. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And greetings, everyone. I would like to share a paper that is a collaborative effort between a relatively large group of authors in working in Chinese and American institutions of higher education. The disciplinary background of the authors represent a number of different fields, including engineering and higher education research, and a few of us from the field of engineering education research. And I choose to share this paper because I think it offers an interesting case that both illustrates and complicates an important theme of the globalization of higher education, which has been very well articulated by Marginson as the global dimension of higher education is formed by acts of imagining. We found that there are several relevant lessons about the imaginaries about global higher education that are embodied in a close reading of some of the discourses of engineering education. So in particular, this paper compares visions of engineers for the future and related recommendations for reforming engineering education through reading the policy texts by communities of engineering educators in China and the United States. And one of the relevant lessons with regard to global imaginary is the fact that we found that engineering education provides a medium through which some of the separate imaginaries that are usually dealt with in individual fashions are actually intertwined together. So in particular, we find that in both policy discourses by communities of American and Chinese engineering educators, there is a high level of convergence when it comes to how they assess the structural forces that shape engineering education. Namely, both communities identify the updates in technical knowledge and employers' demands for engineer skill sets, as well as the aspiration of the engineering profession to take greater leadership in society as the three major shaping forces for the future of engineering education. And what we can see here is that the imaginaries of technology, economy, and society, which are often dealt with, as I mentioned, in separate intellectual conversations, are intersecting with each other through the medium or through the field of engineering education discourse. And another somewhat related finding is that the communities of engineering educators in China and the US has each endorsed dominant imaginaries about the global landscape of engineering education in very interesting ways that are illustrative of historical trajectories of making sense of the global order. And in particular, in the Chinese discourse, we see a salient belief in a hierarchy, or in other words, different tiers of engineering education excellence distributed in around the globe. Whereas in the US case, we see a clear logic that describes the global dynamics as a leader versus challenger dynamics when it comes to engineering education. And we can trace some of the historical arrangings of some of these ways of imagining. For example, the tiers of engineering education power discourse can be traced back to the rhetoric of first, second, and third world discourse in the Cold War era. And very similarly, we can see at least going back to 1957 when the launching of the Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union was considered a waking up and also a highly threatening moment for US to think about real challenge to its leadership, to its global leadership in engineering and STEM education. So we think that the case of engineering education really complicates the ways that we talk about different imaginaries about the global order and global landscape of higher education. So with that, I will pass it back to David for his reflection on these talks.
Yeah, so thanks very much, David. And just for me to say this final section of our webinar, we felt it important not just to have 4 talks, but to really be looking across the 4 contributions, drawing out threads. And I know that you all are going to come forward with questions that take it further, but we're going to start the conversation. Each of the speakers is going to have an incredibly short sound bite. We're aiming for 90 seconds each, just commenting on the others. And David Knight is going to kick us off on that. So thanks, David.
Sure. So I appreciate my colleagues' talks. One of the things that I hadn't really thought too much about before seeing their slides is the idea that within the DBER space, we're unique in engineering education in that we are focused on a professional field. And I think that actually has is really important to keep in mind as we think about going back and forth between higher ed and engineering ed. So some of the things that sets engineering apart are that relative to some of the other DBER spaces, we have a clearer set of goals. We have a set of external influences. So we had some examples of accrediting bodies, government bodies that are very focused on what those goals should be, on influencing what those goals should be. And students go through a fairly comparable curriculum across institutions. And so I think it does create this space where if you have these big, broad ideas in higher ed, you can test out how do they play out in a specific context where you don't have a ton of variation within that context. And I think that makes us in engineering ed look very different from our colleagues in science ed or math ed, where you see a lot more variability in the context of study. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking about since I saw my colleagues' slides. I'll pass on to the next person.
Yeah, Denver, over to you.
Sure. Thanks. And what I found interesting is that I think an important shaping force behind some of the DBER efforts is the notion of profession. At least it applies to fields like medical education and engineering education, business education, and so forth. And what I found really helpful from the 3 colleagues' talks and papers is actually that the boundary of profession is articulated through the various units where the knowledge has been tested. For example, I think in Nicky's talk, it shows how the boundary between theory and practice, or between academic knowledge and practical knowledge, has been articulated in that particular context. And then in David's talk, it shows how the boundary of who belongs into the professional group, who can be considered an engineering student versus just a community college student, is articulated through the enrollment policy. And similarly, I think in Mike's talk, at a different level and scale, it articulates how the boundary of the global versus local profession is being played out through different strategies and practices of accreditation accreditation compliance strategies. So I think that is one of the things that I would take away from this, what I see as basically the EER is actualizing the particular boundaries of this general notion of what is a profession.
Good. Thanks, Denver. Mike, over to you.
Thanks. One of the threads that Denver eloquently introduced that I think is an exciting new frontier for engineering education research is comparative work. I think, on the one hand, as David mentioned, there are some structures that might lead us to see similarity in the curriculum and the focus of engineering, at least within one national context. But I think Denver's analysis of differences in the kind of macro framing of the profession, its relation to kind of economic competitiveness, et cetera, start to open up a whole line of interesting questions around how a seemingly coherent single professional field could be different in different national contexts, and how that plays out, and what the implications are. And I see that on two levels. I think one is studies of the educational process itself, and the other, a place that Jenni and I and some other colleagues have been getting quite excited, is also looking at how the research field of engineering education research takes on different shapes and different forms with different emphases, depending on the national context, whether that's the funding, the type of academic structures, and whether we see the kind of influence of strong fields like academic development in the South African context, whether we see large research grants and kind of legitimacy and department structures in the US. So I think the comparative angle is another place where we can get into the specifics of one profession and feed those insights back into the broad questions of higher education.
Thanks, Mike. Nicky.
Yeah, thanks. I find it fascinating how my focus kind of stays on this idea of the relationship between the general and the particular. And although I've always focused on the knowledge angle of it, sort of in the curriculum space, it's been fascinating to me to work with my colleagues around how the same kind of patterns are evident even at the higher policy level. And again, it just keeps alerting me to this thing of, we've got to have generalizable ideas, policies, because you can't be locked in one context. But the problem is always translating them into that context in a way that works without losing the link to the other contexts defined by this generalizability. So yeah, thanks, Jenni. Hand it back to you.
I think you really you wrapped us up really nicely. I'm writing as you're speaking there. I thought you pulled that together nicely at the end. So, folks, that's the end of our formal presentation. Simon, you never believed we'd do that in 30 minutes, and we did. 4 speakers. Just thanks everyone, because it was quite a lot of planning, as you can see, that put that together. We all want to acknowledge all our funders and our institutions, and I do want. I'm omitted to say at the start, I didn't give any biographical details for anyone. If you want that, it's on the website of the webinar. We assume you read that. So Simon, back to you. I'm going to stop sharing and hand the mic back to you.
Good, and thank you, Jenni and speakers. And we've already got some people in the chat actively wanting to raise issues. So we're going to ask Bruce Clute to come in first. Bruce, please.
Hi, good day. Thanks so much. Our question to Denver, I was really interested in what you had to say, Denver. It's just about your paper comparing the Chinese and American kind of imaginings. The influence of the Washington Accord really through the US. I'm amazed. China's signing of that. How do you think that impacts those intertwined imaginaries? I mean, is there a coherent understanding of that, or is there not one actor there?
Thank you, Bruce. I actually haven't thought about it. Now, I think it's a very helpful angle to think about sort of the lack of coherence perhaps in it. By the way, I just want to acknowledge that I've been reading your work and being quite inspired by it. So it's great to see you in person.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things is there is one type of rhetoric, which is to say that the signing on the Washington Accord shows that we have entered like the first tier, because now it's being acknowledged as equivalent to the so-called powers or sort of the first-rate engineering education nations. But in the meantime, of course, there's another kind of interesting little fact, which is that there used to be Chinese institutions who have been applying and getting accredited by ABET. Now, after the signing of Washington Accord, that has been forbidden within the nation, because there is that, I think there's that motivation to prove that our domestic accreditation is as equal as the international counterpart. So there is no need or no reason to actually reach out to get foreign accreditation. So that, in a way, I think that shows still sort of the different competing anxieties about, or imaginaries, to come back to the theme about where we stand in positioning to the leader in this field. So I just want to, I think I will continue to think about it, but I've started to see this tension in it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, really interesting.
Thanks, Bruce.
Our next speaker is Tim Drysdale. Tim.
Hi, thanks everyone. Tim Drysdale, Chair of Technology Enhanced Science Education at the University of Edinburgh. I've been worrying about the scaling of the number of students that we have across the world, and the things that Ruth Graham has pointed out in a report about how do we give people the experience we want them to have. And I think this might resonate most closely with what Nicky was thinking, but I'm trying to understand from your perspective what you think the unique engineering education research challenges might be for this field as we go about trying to systematically and explicitly put back into an overpressured, highly scaled system the kind of stuff we used to get by accident when good people were in the room with small groups of people and they went under time portion, they could have a good old chat. And indeed, whether you have a different take on the nature of engineering education now as we scale.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Let me take that. I'm so inclined to say one thing I've learned about being a researcher that is different than being a practitioner is that as researchers, we understand the problem and the practitioners have to solve it. And I mean, I think I completely resonate with what you're saying there, because certainly what I'm looking at is really complex critical thinking. And it is much more of a mentored process than a taught knowledge process. It doesn't lend itself to multiple choice questions. So yeah, I completely agree with your concern, and I actually really don't know where to turn, to be perfectly honest. So sorry, that's not a very optimistic answer.
Can I chime in?
And our next question is from Marcia.
Marcia, can we just get a quick bit from David Knight also?
Oh yes, of course.
Question,
And
if you don't mind. So
we've got space for any member of the panel to come in.
Sorry.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think the one tidbit from Ruth Graham's report that I think we really need to pay attention to is that this scale question is really where I think engineering education research should go in the future, is headed in the future. I think we have a lot of good examples of small boutique programs that have excellent learning opportunities for students, but it doesn't match the reality of the numbers that we're actually dealing with in this space. And so I think you raised a really great point here, that it's a challenge. We don't know how to do it well, but I think that's the direction that research is going to go within this space.
Okay, if there's no further from the panel, let's bring in Marcia now. Marcia.
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. I don't have much of a question, more of a reflection. I'm super excited about hearing that more and more people are looking into the comparative space, because I think we have a lot to learn. And as engineering education is becoming more international, it also becomes more important to be very aware of where we're differing. So within education, there used to be a tiny little niche field called comparative education with a well-defined set of methodologies. And I just want to point out that these are there. There's some really interesting work done. It's slightly dated, so I think it's up to us to make it ours and to update it to the current challenges. But I think we have a lot to build on from that space. So I think that's great. And the other minor remark, I have worked in engineering education for a long time, but I also worked in medical education and teacher training education. And although, of course, we have very different goals, we are all workplace related training programs. We're all looking at applying high-level knowledge in real-world situations, working with people, solving real issues. And within the medical education discipline, there's a lot of knowledge already about, for instance, scaling. It's a lot of knowledge about how to study real learning and how to integrate, training on the job. I think we have a lot to learn from those disciplines too. So I would really like to see, a broader outlook on what is engineering education and where can we go for knowledge. Higher education is a great place, but there's deeper fields, I think, that we have to learn a lot to learn from too. So thank you.
I might just respond to that just to reinforce it. I think you're absolutely right about the strength and the existence of an entire community of comparative education researchers and scholars. I was quite lucky in my PhD program to get to take a course with the legend Ruth Hayhoe, who was a former president of the CIES, and absolute masterclass in the fundamental paradigms and worldviews of comparative education. And so I think there's a ton we can learn by engaging in that, drawing some of the methodologies and theories and types of research design. So I think there's a great potential for synergy there. And I'd also reinforce your second point. I think a few people have made comments in the chat to this extent, but I think one of the benefits, because when we say DBER, we're talking about discipline-based, but there's a big difference between kind of what Bernstein would call the singular disciplines, sociology or even mathematics, and the regions or the professions that have this embedded kind of tenuous relationship with a professional body and a field of practice. And I think, thinking about engineering as a region or as a profession in that sense, I think will help us open our eyes to kind of interesting kind of distinctiveness, but also some of the patterns in terms of, the role of external bodies kind of shaping discussions of the curriculum, assumptions around relationships with employers, that kind of space. So it was great to see that coming up in some of my colleagues' contributions today. And I think we can do more in that space, and even some papers that I've been a reviewer on within higher education journals, kind of framing teaching and social work and law and medicine. I think we've got a lot more we could learn looking horizontally too, that sometimes we ignore.
Yeah, and I want to very briefly just echo both of the questioner and Mike's emphasis on the comparative approach, actually. So Jenny and I and another colleague, we are right now writing a chapter for a new volume of Engineering Education Research Handbook. And the theme is to introduce the methods and theories of comparative education into the field of engineering education research, because we think that this would be a productive approach to further both promote and to more formally engage with some of its methodological commitments and paradigms. And I'm happy to point out that the editor for our handbook, Aditya Jory, is also here among the audience today. So it shows that we're definitely paying attention. We are eager to strengthen this bridge. Thanks.
Anyone else from the panel? Thanks, Denver. Let's bring in Alison now. Alison Gwynn Evans.
Hi there. I'm from Cape Town. Yeah, when I think it was Bruce raised China and America sitting together with the Washington Accord, it really just struck me the huge, almost political statement that involves, and how to work it, the question of how it will go forward, the grandstanding, the political posturing, or how are they going to go forward? And it just seemed to me to emphasize the importance of ethics, and then the question of how you define ethics, whether it's knowledge of, or beyond that, skills, attitudes, being explicit about values, will be important for how nations walk forward in this as engineering, as co-signatories, etc. So for me, it was just an interesting thought.
Who would like to pick that up? No takers?
I feel like I would love to hear my colleagues, since I was presenting by the China US, but I just very briefly, just a very quick response is I think, because I work in the space of engineering ethics as well, and I know that a lot of the education in that space is much more focused on the individual choices and individual responsibility of engineers. But I think one of the things that Alice pointed out very important, which I think has been much of a relevant theme in the general space of ethics, is the conversational ethics, which is how do we conduct ethical conversation with people in the different discursive community. I just want to share that quick reaction to your comment.
Thanks, Timber. Can we bring in Per now? Per Fagril.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Per Fagrell from KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. And thank you for a very interesting seminar. And nice to see some people I know in the panel. I have a question about these three major forces that Denver Tang talked about that shapes engineering education. You know, the technical knowledge, the employer's demand, and aspirations of the engineering profession. Are the three forces evenly distributed? And secondly, would it be kind of doable to apply this take on what shapes education into other disciplines, kind of according to what Marcus said earlier about merging this kind of research into other disciplines? Thank you.
Thanks. And I want to point out, actually, Jenny and David are both co-authors on this paper. So I really want to hear my colleagues' take on this.
Okay, go for it.
David, do you want to take that, or should I? I'm just feeling very energized by the rich comments here, and feeling more like, I mean, Alison put in ethics on the table, which of course has not got a universal definition. Just recently reviewing a paper for this chapter around Chinese and US concepts of what is engineering ethics has really opened that up for me. You know, and the question on the forces shaping engineering ed and relative impacts, you know, I want us to also disaggregate rhetorical or symbolic work rather than the actual. And so we do engage in a lot of rhetorical work in engineering education. And then there's work on the ground. And I mean, one could even look at, we all now accredit our degrees on basis of outcomes. And there are really good scholars who show that some aspects of that work can have a rhetorical move as well, or a sort of bureaucratic compliance. And maybe Mike is really the one to speak to this. And some of the subjects, the way they are still taught in engineering degrees and the way that they are assessed have been relatively impervious to those kind of changes. So I think it is fascinating, like any, you know, I'm thinking of who uses, I think Mayton uses that Bourdieu's ideas to think about refraction of policy and like the strength of an academic field and how sort of open it is, how permeable it is to external forces. I do think the rise of status of engineering within society and the university in these decades is extraordinary, because another paper I'm writing has a 1970s article showing how engineering programs in Scotland were all working class students. And I just think, wow, a lot has changed. So I should stop right there, but I do think these are excellent questions.
I think the only thing I'll add is, you know, in the paper, we didn't talk about, you know, frequency or how these forces are distributed across these three. I think it would really depend on what group of stakeholders you're talking to, on which one is emphasized. So if I think about talking to academics or faculty, you would probably hear more about the technical knowledge dimension. If you talk to some university administrators, students even, or certainly advisory board members, employers, you would hear more about number 2. And I think for number 3, I would say that that's probably being driven more by industry, government bodies, external forces of where the field should go. So I don't think it's an easy answer in terms of distribution. It really depends on what group of stakeholders you're talking to.
Thank you all. Aditya now, Aditya Jory.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking my question. I'm Aditya Jory. I'm a professor at George Mason. Usually, these days, I'm a Fulbright Distinguished Chair at Aalto University in Finland. So this is good timing. So my question, I think I'm trying to get at the political economy of engineering as a profession. And, you know, even going back and looking historically at colonialism and how it really became a profession because you needed engineers to go to different parts of the world, like the British needed them for India. And that's where the working class people who would go and spend their life somewhere else kind of started becoming part of that. That's how engineering knowledge went there, first institutes came about, and looking at those global flows even now, because I think one of the shifts that has happened in higher education, and we are looking at like institutions of engineering, but if you really talk about engineers, them moving across the globe, whether from India to all over the world, China to US, back to China, this so on and so forth, has really changed how engineering as a profession functions. So I just wanted to get the take of the panel on that aspect, rather than just focusing on institution, what's happening overall in engineering as a profession.
A number of people might want to answer that. So who wants to go first?
Yeah, I can take a first crack. I think I can probably answer less of exactly how the profession is moving, but I think there's some interesting tools, getting back to the theme of the webinar, kind of tools we can draw from the literature to think about that in different ways. So we were talking earlier about treating engineering as a profession, and like you say, Aditya, what's the political economy of the profession? I think there's a huge body of literature that we largely don't even scratch the surface of, coming from the sociology of professions, which has great theoretical tools for thinking about the politics of a profession, the notion of a professional project, and really some of the claims that professions make, essentially in order to get the state in their given national context to kind of give them a monopoly on practice. And within that field, I think there's a kind of interesting gap that we as engineering education researchers could contribute to, which is what happens with globalization. And, you know, engineering clearly is a rapidly globalized profession. Like, how do you think about the sociology of professions differently at a kind of global or transnational scale? Because all of our assumptions are based on the nation state and the scope of practice in one country, but engineers are moving around and they're working for corporations that are global. And so, I mean, I think that I've seen a few articles on the notion of like, what is a transnational sociology of professions? And part of that means you have to take international actors and organizations like, you know, the International Engineering Alliance. You have to think about how you theorize them and the role that they're playing. And you also have to realize like the type of profession that we are is more of a corporate profession. So it's not just going to be analyzing the bodies. We have to look at the structure of corporations and how they're organizing work. And, you know, I think ethics is governed a lot more by corporations than they are by codes of conduct of professional bodies. So to me, I'm just kind of opening up that space, but I do think there's theoretical tools and models. There's some unanswered questions that, again, engineering could feed into a kind of more nuanced sociology professions debate if we grapple with those. So thanks for posing the question.
And I want to quickly add, I think Aditya, you really, your question helped me think about another dimension where I think engineering education offers a unique case when it comes to thinking about the global higher education, because I think Alice was mentioning that engineering, she was stressing the political nature of engineering profession. But I think the other thing, drawing from my old SDS background, is that I think part of the reason that engineering as a profession has such strong global sort of mobility is related with the fact that engineering and technology is usually considered apolitical and therefore has sort of the currency to move. And now I think that, of course, that only exists at the rhetorical level, but to some extent, I think that imaginary about engineering as apolitical perhaps in an important way shapes its mobility. So that draws a lot of questions for us to further look into, I guess. So thank you for that question.
Colleagues, we might move on. I think we've got 2 more speakers on the list, and perhaps, Jenny, I can then pass back to you and you could take the panel through short final wrap up. We usually linger a little bit after the hour, about 5 past is the real cutoff point, I think. Now, Christina Elstrom.
Thank you, and thank you all for this interesting seminar. I noted, and I'm going to tag on to what Mike said. I noted that there were theories. You could hear that there were theories in use here. I've heard words that I would trace to the sociological discourse analysis. I realized only today that Mike is a neo-institutional theory aficionado. I'd like to go out for a beer and discuss that. And I think we can draw on so many different research approaches, methodologies, all the conceptualization that is done. There are some fields where there might be 50 years of really great work that is super relevant to us. And I feel that in engineering education research, we can use all the toolboxes and the treasure chests from all disciplines. And I just think about STS with their historical lens. There are so many opportunities. And I think we should keep this in mind when we do PhD education. So we don't teach our junior scholars too narrowly. And I think we can also consider it when it comes to the journal landscape. Many of the attendants here are editors and beloved reviewers of the European Journal of Engineering Education. And I just wanted to advertise that we really are fond of boundary work and boundary people. So that's a welcome to submit interesting work to us. And I think this, considering the dialogue with higher education can be a little bit overwhelming, considering that's like a really big field, but at least I think in the professional fields, we have so much in common. It's stupid to be pigeonholed and not have a lively discussion with each other. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Who would like to pick up the challenge of theory? Okay. If no one does, I'm going to bring in Jennifer Walsh-Marr now, and you could, I think, all take the opportunity to respond to everyone when you wrap up. Jennifer.
Thank you. So I note that this panel is in English and wonder if you can speak to its use within the field of international engineering, as well as developing engineering-specific communication skills within undergraduate curricula.
Jenny, I might pass back to you. You could maybe take the panel through a response on that point and on everything else, and then we can wrap up and say goodbye.
So Jennifer, I really appreciate that really important reminder, and it is very easy to sometimes live in this English speaking bubble. So absolutely, there are very significant engineering education communities in some parts of the world that have equivalent conversations to what we're having today, not in English. I think with South America being most with the one really very significant group that sometimes is working in some different frameworks and has certainly adopted a different stance in relation to Washington Accord, global rankings and things like that. So I think that's a topic maybe for another great webinar. I don't want that to seem like an easy out, but I think what I'd like to say in closing is, to me, the quality not only of what the presenters put forward, but how the audience engaged is fantastic to see. A lot of engineering ed people across the globe here in the seminar today, alongside higher ed scholars. I think, we posed a question, is there anything of interest in engineering ed for higher ed? And I feel like we've at least got a resounding yes there. I feel that, the stereotype might be that engineers just like, work in a very superficial way to kind of deal with practical problems. But I think what is demonstrated here is that's never going to be adequate to a way of really grappling with the field of higher education. And I think the breadth of discussions here across in sociology, history, political economy, policy has been very, very energizing. And we actually haven't even spoken that much today around teaching and learning, even though that was particularly noted by the comment on scale from Drysdale, I'm thinking Tim, yeah. So Simon, I think if there's a moment for each of the panelists just to again say one sort of final word, I think I'll be happy to give them each a chance. Should I call on you? Yeah. I think unmute yourself when you're ready to speak. And on that basis, I'll say, Denver, you should go. Any final comment you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to share that I am grateful and so pleasantly surprised about this engagement that I was expecting more awkward silence, but I think what I found is that there's only awkward silence when it comes to speakers responding, but the audience is totally engaged. So it's real joy. Thanks, everyone.
Mm-hmm. Nicky?
Yeah, thanks everyone. And just to tag on Jenny, you're saying yes, there's an appetite for something that engineering education research can offer more broadly. But I think there was also a big warning that there are other disciplinary research fields, education research fields that we do need to take more seriously. But it is also interesting just how much theory is out there to use. And it's almost a little intimidating there is so much out there. So how do we as a community manage our way around useful, productive stuff without leaving out stuff that appears unproductive, but if we actually got into it, it's a huge challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, both ways. Theory both ways. Thanks.
I was just going to pick up on that thread. I think the theory question is a really important one, and amazing to see the breadth that we're kind of bouncing around here. Another observation that I've had kind of moving between countries for my research is the ways that the kind of theory preferences also vary depending on your context. And I've always been drawn to South Africa and Cape Town in particular, because you've got this group of scholars really steeped in the sociological theories and their application to engineering education research. And I'm sure different countries have those different pockets. And I think we can keep kind of learning from each other through these kind of forums. So thanks for some great questions and for hosting us, Jenny and Simon.
Sure. David Knight, over to you.
Sure, and I'll just echo what my colleagues have said. I really appreciate the energy in this conversation. I really didn't know what to expect, and this has been fantastic. What I've been thinking about for the past few minutes has been really grappling with this comparison between medical education and engineering education. I think there are some real similarities where the fields can learn from each other. I think you raised a really interesting contrast between those two spaces in terms of thinking about political economy. I also think the fact that undergraduates are a big component of engineering ed research is a major difference between the two spaces. And so I'm just thinking about, where can we learn from each other? But I think some of the distinctions are really important still.
Simon, back to you to close us out officially.
And thank you all. I mean, I think we've got to know you. Those of us who didn't already know you, we've got to know you well from this conversation, and you've shared so much and so generously, but so have the participants in the audience. And this is a very strong field. You can see how much energy and excitement there is around these issues, and it bodes really well, I think, for all the work that all of you are doing. That you've got so many good colleagues and such a good, general framework of discussion. Next webinar, folks, is next Tuesday. and we've had to scrape the absolute bottom of the barrel to fill the program next week. The paper is on a very important topic, which is the rise of research in China, but we've had to fall back on me as one of the presenters. Fortunately, the other presenter is my outstanding colleague, Xin Shu. We will talk about social science as well as STEM, and attempt to get to grips with this extraordinary juggernaut, which is Chinese science and the rise of Chinese science, but also talk about the more complicated and problematic terrain of social science and humanities. So we look forward to seeing you all, I hope. All engineering educators are most welcome to come and talk to us about China. I'm sure Denver can be tempted if his schedule is free. Perhaps the rest of you can join him as well. And we look forward to having you back, Jenni, and team. I think that was a great discussion. So if you want to develop further discussions through our program, we'd be most welcome. You'd be most welcome to do so. So it's bye for now, and thanks again to everyone. Really look forward to seeing you all in future. Bye.
Thanks.